Uh, Then the recording will be posted on the college's YouTube page in the next few days. You're welcome to turn off your camera if you don't want to use up the broadband. Unmute your mic. We can do a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. But before we really get started, I need to read the Cayuga Land Acknowledgement that was approved by the faculty in 2018. It's read before every event, virtual or in person, on the Wells College campus, out of respect for the indigenous people who lived on this land before us. Here we go. Wells College recognizes our collective responsibility to acknowledge our colonial history. This land is the traditional land of the Cayuga Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Wells College commits itself to ensuring the traditions and culture of indigenous peoples are embraced and reflected upon in order to engage in solidarity with the Cayuga Nation. If you have any questions about tonight's presentation or the virtual Learning by the Lake series, you can send a message to alumoffice@wells.edu, and our new assistant director for alumni and alumni engagement, Audrey Wooliver, and I will both receive it, and one of us will get back to you, I promise. Thanks again for coming tonight. Take it away, Randy and Fran.
Thanks, Una, and good evening to everybody. I hope you'll mute your mics and then we can have a Q&A session at the end. But good evening and welcome to Learning by the Lake. This is the monthly webinar that Wells College sponsors, and it's on the second Wednesday of every month during the academic year. As Una introduced us, my name's Randy Kissell, and my wife Fran and I have prepared this talk, and we titled it, "A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Aurora, Planes, Trains, Boats, and Omnibuses." If you don't know what an omnibus is, you're in good company. I didn't know either before I prepared this, so we'll get to that. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about us and why we're talking about traveling to Aurora, which, as many of you, I think, well know, is the home of Wells College. Now, I went to Cornell, which is about 26.1 miles south of Wells, give or take a few hundred feet. And I happen to know the mileage because during the time I was at Cornell in Ithaca, I made a few trips to Wells, where I met a student who became my wife, Fran Trubilla. And since 1974, I think I've made hundreds of trips to Wells from various places throughout the US. And since 1979, Fran and I have made those trips together and really enjoyed coming to Wells. But those of you who have been to Wells know that Aurora is not always real easy to get to. In fact, pretty much never is. And that's not new. And I think people have been struggling to get there for a long time. And I thought a retrospective look at those efforts might be interesting, particularly because Una called me up a couple of months ago and said, "Hey, we don't have anybody to do the March Learning by the Lake. What can you come up with?"
Rand will do most of the speaking, but I'll come in with a couple of stories. This time I served primarily as his research assistant.
And did a good job, by the way. And I should also thank Jane Marsh Dykeman for her help and for her book on Wells College history. And for the tidbits of stories that she gave me that I incorporated in the talk. But before we start, a big thank you to Wells College for sponsoring the presentation. And Wells recently enjoyed its 150th anniversary, having been founded in Aurora, New York by Henry Wells back in 1868. And people have been struggling to get there ever since. Now, Henry also founded the American Express and Wells Fargo companies in addition to Wells. And Wells being a college for women was a very radical concept in 1868 at that time. But why did he pick Aurora as a site for the college? Well, I think the answer to that question, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And a lot of things have changed since 1868, but one thing hasn't, and that's the beautiful physical setting of Wells, particularly things like sunsets over the lake. And apparently, after an especially dramatic sunset, Henry Wells is reported to have said, "There, even Lake Como can't surpass that." And he had traveled quite a lot because he was one of the original road warriors. And he became a road warrior in the process of establishing express companies in the years before the American Civil War. Express companies were a new concept, but basically what it was people didn't trust the US Post Office, and they didn't want to send money and security through the postal system. And so Henry came up with the idea of express companies that would provide that sort of courier service or delivery service. And they transported essential items and like securities and bonds and cash. And they were essentially the FedEx and UPS of their day. As a matter of fact, Henry was so successful that around the 1850s, he made an offer to the American government to replace the services of the Postal Service. But in that would have put 16,000 people out of work, the answer was no. But another reason that the college is in Aurora is that in the mid 1800s, Aurora was in what you could call the Silicon Valley of its day. The Erie Canal, which linked New York City via the Hudson River to Buffalo, New York, the Great Lakes, and all points west, was the interstate highway of its day. And Aurora was on Cayuga Lake, and the lake has access to the canal. So Aurora was right in the thick of it. And in fact, after wagons or walking, boats were the first mode of transportation that were used to reach wells. And this picture here from the college's collection shows the lake steamer Iroquois at the Aurora Village dock sometime in the 1870s. Now, steamers began regular service on Lake Cayuga around 1866. And in 1905, there were 3 steamships that were operating, and they had 2 scheduled trips from Aurora to Ithaca daily, one at 9 a.m. and the other at 3:30 in the afternoon. So I guess it took, a few hours, maybe the better part of daylight to make that trip. And you couldn't just surf the internet on your phone on the way down. You probably just had to look at the water and the scenery and let life go by. Now, boats carried both passengers and materials up and down the lake. And Henry Wells' home, which is called Glen Park and today is a Wells dorm, it had a dock on Lake Cayuga that basically served as what we would call its driveway today. And at the first big attendance events that were held at the site of Wells College in the 1860s, things like the inauguration, dedication, that type of stuff, most people arrived by boat, as did all the building materials. All the bricks in Maine and Morgan and the original buildings had to come by boat on the lake. The Wells College boathouse was built in 1898 at the site of the Glen Park dock, and it replaced a little shanty that had been used since about 1876 at the site. And then in the summer of 1900, a pier and breakwater were added, as you see in this picture. Now, unfortunately, though, on July 27th, 1907, one of the 3 boats that was used for regular steamer service on Lake Cayuga, the Frontenac, it caught fire and was beached about 500 feet from the shore, from the land up at Dill's Cove, which is just north of Aurora. 8 passengers died and service ended, and it never resumed. So it sort of reminds you like of the Concorde, in its final crash and never resuming service here today. Now, boats were soon eclipsed by the railroads, but boats have continued to serve some people going to Wells. As a matter of fact, when Bob Plain became Wells' 16th president in 1991, he lived in Ovid, New York, which is exactly on the opposite side of Cayuga Lake from Wells, from Aurora, on the west side. And during his presidency, he sometimes commuted by boat across the lake. It was 4 miles by boat, and that really beat 40 miles by car. So, that sounds like a good deal. And I've always envied him. And then after he retired in 1995, he sold his farm and winery, and the winery today operates as the Thirsty Owl. And from there, on a clear day, you can see Main Building and the bell tower on the Wells campus. And it's especially facilitated if you have a glass of Riesling in your hand while you imagine looking across the lake. But the lake was not only a highway, but it was also an obstacle because, like I said, you have to go around it unless you take a boat on it. And in 1800, a 5,412-foot long wooden bridge was built across the northern end of Lake Cayuga, where the lake is only about 6 to 10 feet deep. And it went from the present-day town of Cayuga on the eastern shore over to the west side of the lake where a huge toll house was located. I think it also served as a bar and grill and probably an inn for overnight travelers. And when the bridge was built, it was actually the longest bridge in the Western Hemisphere, right here on Cayuga Lake. Pretty cool. And it could accommodate 3 wagons across. And the Cayuga County Jail was located under the east end of the bridge. And so I guess punishment for criminals was to have to live underneath boards that horses were passing over quite frequently. But unfortunately, being made of wood and being founded on the mud at the bottom of the lake, the bridge had a lot of deterioration problems. It collapsed in 1808, and then it had to be rebuilt, which was done by about 1812. Well, it was replaced again in 1833, but finally abandoned in 1858. And it really was a victim not only of deterioration and the construction, but also of competition, first from the Erie Canal, and then later on from the railroads. Interestingly, in 1929 and again in 1930, the New York State Legislature passed bills authorizing the construction of a new highway bridge on Cayuga's Long Bridge right-of-way. There was some local opposition, though, and funding problems, and New York's governor at the time was Franklin Roosevelt. He vetoed both of those bills, saying, hey, we just don't have the money. Later on, as president, FDR spent money more freely, but the feds were able to print money, whereas even New York State can't do that. Now, of course, one of the problems with travel by boat on the lake is that boats generally can't operate in the winter because there's a lot of ice on the lake, particularly in those days. And overland travel was difficult since it was either icy or muddy, and sleighs were used in the wintertime. And this picture, which appears in Jane's book on the history of Wells College, is from Henry Morgan's sleigh, and it has notes on the back of it that is dated January 15th, 1881. And the note reads, Mercury 2 degrees below zero, calm and splendid day, but continued cold. And I guess those pelts there, I don't know what animal that is, but they must have been useful. Now, at other times of the year, as I said, it was either icy or it was muddy. And in other times of the year, you went over unpaved roads by foot or wagon. And here's a view looking north towards Aurora on what today is New York Route 90. So if you think it's slow going on 90 today, you should have tried it back in the 1800s. Now, the roads remained unpaved until around 1930 or so, when New York Route 90 got its designation as 90. But in the early 1900s, the main street of Aurora, which today is Route 90, looked just like you see in the picture here. The college is down the road on the left, but you feel like you're looking at a road less traveled, just out in the woods, dirt road. Now, while travel by boat on rivers, lakes, and canals was the fastest way to go in the first half of the 1800s, in the second half of the 1800s, the railroads were the way to go. And when the college was founded, the nearest rail lines to Aurora only went to Cayuga, which was 13 miles to the north, where the New York Central operated, and Ithaca, which is 26 miles to the south, which was served by several lines, including the Lehigh Valley Railroad. But to bring rail service to Aurora, Henry Wells and E.B. Morgan, who was Henry's friend and an early benefactor of the college, they founded the Cayuga Lake Railroad in 1867. So Cayuga Lake had its own railroad. And on September 24th, 1872, after construction was complete for the rail line from Cayuga down to Aurora, the train ran down, and Morgan wrote in his diary, and his house was on the lakeshore just north of the present-day Aurora Inn, that the locomotive reached the Aurora House station. It passed over my lawn at 8:30 p.m., a strange sight in Aurora. And this picture from around 1900 shows the train going by a windmill in Aurora that was used to generate electricity in the village. And yes, this does look very strange to me even today.
To give you an idea of just how complicated travel could be, let me tell you about a particular day in 1870 that involved the entire college and William Seward. Henry Wells and William Seward were great friends. And William Seward was home from Cuba just a few weeks before his birthday on May 16th. And he decided he was having a birthday party, and he invited the entire college. And Henry Wells was happy to accept on behalf of the entire college. So on that date, all 42 students, Henry, his friend E.B. Morgan, Mary Carter, the lady principal of the college, and all of the remaining instructors, so 50 people in all, got up early and went to pick up the steamer at the dock. From there, they had to travel to Cayuga, at which point they boarded the train, which took them into Auburn. Now, in those days, the train depot would let you out on the street directly across from the new state prison. And Mary Carter, being determined that no matter what was going on, that Wells women would get some kind of educational benefit from it, decided that her students would receive a tour of the prison before they went to the party. So fortunately, they didn't have far to go to get to that first destination. And they arrived in Auburn at 12:35, did their tour, and by 3 o'clock went over to Seward's home. Now, Seward's home is on the other side of the tracks, literally. I don't know exactly, but I would anticipate it's about a mile, maybe a little bit more. And I'm not clear how they got there. I have this vision in my head of them traveling, perhaps just walking down the road with the faculty surrounding them and supervising them. It kind of reminds you of that book Madeleine, with the children from the French orphanage and the nuns supervising them as they walk 2 by 2 down the street. But they arrived in time for the party and had themselves a wonderful evening, and had to make the whole trip in reverse in order to come back to go to class the next day. Now we run over to Auburn just to go pick up some groceries. I'll let you.
All right. The first rail passenger car that came all the way to Aurora, negating the need to take the steamer up to Cayuga, was in 1873, and then the line was completed down to Ithaca about that time also. But unfortunately, about a month after the line was completed to Ithaca, there was a flood that washed out the rail bed, and the Cayuga Lake Railroad went bankrupt. So it had a very brief history. And Henry Wells and his friend E.B. Morgan lost a ton of money on that. And having been burned once, I guess they weren't eager to come back for more. And so the Lehigh Valley Railroad acquired the right of way up the side of the lake, the east side of the lake, in the late 1870s. Now, the Lehigh Valley Railroad had started operations in 1855 to move coal that was mined in the northeast part of Pennsylvania, basically the Pocono Mountains, to market in places like Philadelphia and New York. And in fact, I remember my grandparents in New York having a coal bin in the basement of their home with that coal that probably was brought by the Lehigh Valley Railroad or other railroads from places like the Poconos. But in 1876, the Lehigh Valley acquired control over the Geneva, Ithaca, and Sayre Railroad, and they gradually expanded their system till it extended from Buffalo in the Northwest all the way down to New York City. And that included service up the full length of the eastern shore of Lake Cayuga. This map and this slide shows the Lehigh's routes in its heyday of about 1901. Now, by the 1930s, though, with the automobile getting popular, railroads were not only losing money, they were losing passengers. And essentially, the Lehigh had to stop taking passengers in 1961. And by 1976, its properties were taken over by Conrail. Now, today, the Norfolk Southern still operates the line from Ithaca up to Cargill's Cayuga rock salt mine in Lansing. And I don't know if the line continues all the way up to Milliken Power Station or not, but that's the extent of it, and it's just for commercial operations. But the railroad was a great asset to the college, as students were able to take the train to Wells, or at least to Ithaca, right up through the 1950s. And here's a picture from the college's collection of students waiting on the platform for the train in the heyday of trains of 1892. But trains continued for a long time, for 50 years after that, at least. And from information that was given to me by the Wells archivist, in 1942, the train ran between Ithaca and Aurora daily, except on Sundays. It left Ithaca at 7:30 in the morning. It got to Aurora at 8:13 a.m., almost as fast as you can drive there. And then it went on to Auburn, got there at 8:55. And then it made the return trip, leaving Auburn at 11:05. I guess they had to turn it around or whatever, freshen it up. And it came back to Aurora at 11:39 a.m. and was back down to Ithaca a little after lunch at 12:41. And the 1943-44 Wells Student Handbook noted that some students could go shopping in Auburn by taking the morning train up and returning in the evening. When the passenger rail service was discontinued, though, the Aurora station was abandoned, although it's still there. And this picture appeared in the Wells class of '78 yearbook, showing the station really a shadow of its former self. It's kind of sad. But today the station is still there. It's just been turned 90 degrees and it's behind the old Dory's Cafe. The Lehigh Valley Railroad built their Ithaca passenger station in 1898, and they operated up until they discontinued passenger operations in '61. And really back in those days, each town put a lot of pride into its rail station and had architects hired to design them. It was almost like your airport is today for major commercial cities. But in 1966, after the station had been abandoned for service, a guy named Joseph Chashke converted the building into a restaurant. It was known as the station. And it operated until 2005, almost a 40-year run, during which time Fran and I visited the station about as many times as we visited Ithaca.
It was our place.
Yeah, we enjoyed it. But since 2005, I understand the station has housed a branch bank of the Chemung Canal Trust Company, which is not nearly as romantic of a use. And here's a picture of the matchbook that I just so happen to have from the station that showed the hands of the clock outside the station where they were when the last train left. And for a while, the station even operated a little bed and breakfast in addition to the restaurant, and the rooms were in rail cars that they had lined up on the little section of rail behind the station. Now, after passenger service ended, the train still operated up the east side of the lake through Aurora until about 1970 for commercial traffic, freight traffic. At a recent reunion, I heard of an alum, Mary Hotchkiss, 72, who I think is on our call here, who told me that she rode the train that made the last run through Aurora up to Levana, just north of Aurora, and then she walked back to the campus on Route 90. And I think she got this unique opportunity because she knew some guys that were working on the crew on the train that day. I hope she'll stick around and maybe can give us a more accurate and personal account, but I'd be very interested to hear it again. Now, today you can trace the railroad right of way along the lake, but the rails and the ties are long gone. Now, the thing about trains, though, is that unlike the automobile, they usually didn't get you to the doorstep of where you wanted to go. And that last mile was a real problem, especially when you had luggage, and especially when the luggage didn't have those little wheels on it that we take for granted today. Now, the vehicle that was invented to solve that problem was a horse-drawn coach called a station wagon. And it was called that because it got you from the train station to your final destination. And it was just a wagon that was pulled by horses. That name, station wagon, was only later applied to a vehicle, an automobile type that got very popular in the 1960s, about as popular as minivans got in the 1980s. But to transport his students from the dock and later from the train station in Aurora to the college, Henry Wells bought what was called an omnibus, as you see in this picture here. And it arrived on campus in 1868, the very first year of classes. Now, this omnibus was similar to Fifth Avenue buses, as they were called, that Henry saw operating in New York City. New York City had, hundreds, maybe thousands of wagons, all pulled by horses prior to 1900. And their buses were essentially just like this. And it was built by John Stevenson Manufacturing Company of New York, which operated from about 1830 to about 1880. There's only two others known in existence that are like this. And one is in the Shelburne Museum in Vermont, and the other one is in the collection of Jack and Marge Day in Moncton, Maryland. I actually commissioned an appraisal of our omnibus last year, and the appraisal came in between $50,000 and $70,000. So it's actually worth more than most vehicles on the road today. Certainly more than any vehicle I own.
Henry Wells used to also take the students riding in this omnibus on Sundays. So we know that Henry Wells's Fanny was actually in these seats.
Yeah, it is a high mileage vehicle today, though. So the appraised value is kind of interesting. Now, here's the original 1868 serial number that's painted inside the omnibus. And I'm just guessing, but maybe THM number 17 are the initials of the wagon master that built it. And it was the 17th one they produced in 1868 or something like that. But then there's the new coach. And you may not think of it that way, but the Wells other coach is much more familiar to most people than the omnibus, even though it's a relative newcomer at Wells. And it's usually referred to as the Wells Fargo coach. But actually, the correct description is it's an Abbott Downing Concord coach, because it was built by the Abbott Downing Company of Concord, New Hampshire in 1886. So after the omnibus, but it was actually used as a stagecoach out west, and it saw active service on the stage line that went between Fort Steele, Wyoming and Encampment, Wyoming. And it ended that service in 1907. Now, I don't know if it fell victim to competition by internal combustion engines or what, but it apparently sat around for a while, and then it was given to Wells College by a guy named Mr. W.L. Petrikin of Denver, Colorado, as a gift to the college for his daughter's Charlotte's graduation from Wells in 1926. And judging from the attire of people in this picture here, I'd have to guess that this picture was taken about 1926 or shortly thereafter.
And for those of you in the class of 78, the Abbott of the Abbott Downing Concord Company is an ancestor of our own Abby Gear McGrath.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Now, probably because of that original initial use at the college, since then the coaches really only perform ceremonial duties. We don't have anybody going down to the dock to pick you up in the coach, but it's usually used for transporting seniors to graduation, at reunions, and for dignitaries and visitors of the college, presidential inaugurations, that sort of stuff. And the coach was substantially refurbished by Wells staff in the 1980s, and it's a beautiful looking coach. In 2020, its fair market value was appraised at nearly $250,000. And even the Wells Fargo Bank today, which is all over the country, doesn't have a coach that even comes close to this one in condition.
If you're looking to get a coach of your own, though, let's give you a shout out to Hanson Coach and Wagon they're in South Dakota, right?
Yeah.
Which is a company that is very highly specialized. They restore and build replicas of antique coaches and wagons. And they were very, very helpful to us in doing the appraisal. And they also build the replicas that Wells Fargo Bank uses in its business for various public events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hanson's Wheels.
They'll build you one.
But when the automobile came along, basically horses got a rest, and well-deserved, I'm sure. And routine service between the train station and the campus was assumed by a bus that the students called Miss Wells, which shown here in a 1931 picture parked outside of Maine. And I don't know about you, but my reaction at seeing this picture was, wow, that's when steel was cheap. And students could also hop on the college's truck, shown here in the 1940s, for a ride into town or back to campus. Although I have a feeling that folks in the college's transportation department today would really cringe at the safety issues involved with a bunch of undergrads piling in the back of a truck. But we've come a long way since then to the red vans, which today transport Wells students to Ithaca and Auburn and make runs to local airports in slightly more comfortable conditions than their predecessors. This is one of the current vans, and it continues a tradition of what was called in the 1977 handbook that I got. This is the Henry Wells coach line. And I'm not sure, maybe somebody on this call can tell us when we're done here, but I think the red vans originated in the late 60s, even though there had been sort of taxi or shuttle services operating even before that. Now, after World War II, and especially by the 1960s, transportation became synonymous with the automobile. And here comes a student to orientation in 1951 with all of her belongings in a couple of suitcases. The only difference between today, between that and her, is that students today have a lot more stuff, even while they imagine that students who came before them had so much better than them. But once the train stopped, everybody came by car to Aurora.
Unless you took the bus.
Or took the bus, right, as Fran did many times. For over 50 years, from 1967 to 2018, Ithaca's bus station was located west of Fulton Street between West Seneca and West State Streets. And it was designed by the architect Frank Kissell in 1912 as the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad's Ithaca train station. The DL&W, it ended passenger operations in 1942. And Jane Marsh explained to me that maybe part of the reason for that is that the DL&W had become known as the delay, linger, and wait line. But Greyhound acquired the station in 1967. I understand that the station was closed in October 2018. And last I heard, Ithaca was trying to figure out what would come next. And I think the megabus type bus lines have made bus stations obsolete, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, if you really are down on your luck and you can't afford the bus, you can always hitchhike, or at least you could back in the day. In 1975, a fraternity brother and I decided to start hitchhiking for Aurora from Ithaca on a night with a freezing drizzle. And I think you can probably tell where this is going. We got 3 rides patched together to get us as far as Cecil's Tavern, which is right about halfway up the lake. And at that point, we started to realize our mistake. So we decided to hedge our bets. And Doug stood on the north side bound side of the road, and I took the southbound. And we said, hey, the first car that will stop and pick us up, we're going that direction, no matter where that is. And after about 20 minutes of standing there in a dark rain with nobody going by, I distinctly recall Doug declaring that the sound of Cecil's blinking neon light was the loneliest sound he had ever heard. Finally, a car going southbound stopped on my side, so we piled in there. And after something like about 80-mile-an-hour ride down to Ithaca, we got out of the car, we both kissed the ground, and I have never hitchhiked since. But, traveling long distances by car, you need highways, and several of them get you to central New York. It's a little interesting, the history of some of these roads. The first section of the New York State Thruway, which had first been proposed in 1949, opened between Utica and Rochester in June '54. And the rest of the Buffalo to Bronx portion was completed in 1956. And it cost about $4.5 billion in 2019 dollars, last time I checked. And it was at that time the longest toll road in the world. The section from Buffalo to the Pennsylvania state line along Lake Erie out on the western end was finished in 1957. And I drove that portion many times in the 1970s coming up to Wells from Pittsburgh. It goes so close to Lake Erie that sometimes the snow coming off the lake makes you wonder if you're driving on the road or in the lake. And the route that's now Interstate 81 in New York was originally served by New York Route 2, built in 1924, but which was replaced shortly after that by US Route 11, which goes all the way down here, down the Shenandoah Valley and south. That happened around 1927. Then a highway was built that largely followed the route of US 11 in the 1950s. That was called the Penn-Can Highway. And I'm just guessing, but I assume that's because it went from Pennsylvania to Canada. And on August 14th, 1957, it was redesignated under the Interstate Act as Interstate 81. And its final segment built of the final segment of 81 that was built north of the Mason-Dixon line down in Pennsylvania was a 17-mile section in New York, and it opened in October of '68. So since then, it's been continuous in New York State. One last highway, people traveling to Aurora from New York City are quite familiar with New York Route 17. And Route 17 was one of the first original New York State highway routes in 1924 when they started to designate their highways with numbers. But it wasn't a divided highway until the mid-50s when it became New York's first free long-distance expressway. And it was finally completed from Binghamton on down to Harriman in southeast New York in 1968. And I'm so old that in the early 1970s, I got a ride to Cornell with a grad student in his 1965 Corvair, unsafe at any speed, who remembered the days before Route 17 was completed as a divided highway. And he didn't have fond memories of that. But with the completion of those major highways in New York and neighboring states, more students brought cars to campus. VW bugs were popular in the 60s. And this photo of the leach lot shows that. Wells actually had to build lots to hold all the cars. The Woods lot, which is uphill from the library now, and the lot that's uphill from Leach going on up to the Student Union and Center. We take those lots for granted today, but they're relative newcomers to the landscape at Wells. But, you know, the snow that wreaks havoc with travel by car can actually make other forms of travel more appealing. And I understand when Cayuga Lake completely froze over in the winter of 1911-12, there was a senior at Cornell named Floyd Newman, and he had 4 friends, and they decided to take advantage of that. And they skated from the lake's southern tip in Ithaca all the way to the northern end, about 40 miles, before they hopped a train to come back home. And now Floyd's skates are on display in Helen Newman Hall, which he endowed, so I guess he gets to put his skates there, along with Newman Lab and Newman Arboretum. I assume he married Helen, and that's where some of these names came from. But he probably didn't know it, but the lake had frozen over completely in March of 1876 also. And that year, a Wells student named Emma Lampert, who came from that frozen wasteland that some people know as Rochester, she skated across the west side of the lake and back to Aurora, which was a round trip of roughly 7 miles, and had the professors quite concerned about her safety. I understand the lake also froze over in 1918, and large parts froze in 69 and 72, but the lake has not completely frozen over in some time. And some people attribute that fact to climate change, but you also have to consider that discharges from power plants, farm runoff, fertilizer, other industries, households, that makes the lake much less likely to freeze over. And the lake has rarely been frozen over enough for ice boats, although I recently saw an article in the Finger Lakes Times about a few daring souls who actually tried ice boating on the lake. They usually tried it once and that was enough. Speaking of snow, though, over the last 30 years, the average annual snowfall for Aurora is only 56 inches or about 10.5 feet. The other records that I list here are for Ithaca, which are likely kind of similar to Aurora. And I do recall the winter of 77, 78 being snowy, but I didn't realize that my trips to Aurora that year from Pittsburgh were during a record-setting year for snow. I do remember totaling my car in the snowstorm in Buffalo on the way to Wells in March of '78. And Fran recalls it snowing in Aurora on Mother's Day in 1977, which fell on May 8th that year. Not quite a record late snowfall, the latest being May 24th in Ithaca.
It was 7 inches.
Not bad. Here's Ithaca's temperature records for wintertime, and I experienced some cold weather there, but never 25 below. That's cold. Well, the last mode of travel I'll talk about is by plane, and the newest mode, of course, is by plane. And just like driving to Wells, though, flying there can be challenging also. Now, the nearest commercial airport is in Ithaca, which I show here in its natural setting, snow. But the original Ithaca airport was west of downtown Ithaca at the south end of the lake. And you can still see the old hangar there. It's now operating as the Hangar Theater. And I wondered about that when I was a student because I didn't think hangars had anything to do with theater, and that's the connection. But scheduled commercial flights began there in 1948 with Robinson Airlines flying DC-3s. And Robinson was also one of the first airlines to serve Syracuse in 1949 when they opened up their airport. And in '49, Cornell also opened the current Ithaca airport that's up the hill in Lansing. 1952, Robinson changed the name to Mohawk Airlines, which subsequently merged with Allegheny Airlines based in Pittsburgh. Allegheny used to be known to us there as Agony Airlines. That was in 1972, and they eventually became part of US Airways. In 1994, I understand that Ithaca opened a new 33,000 square foot terminal. I think I've been in there, it's pretty nice. And in 2019, they did a major expansion, but I haven't been back since the pandemic to be able to tell you about that. When Syracuse's Hancock International Airport opened in '49, it was in a renovated machine shop for the terminal. And the airlines serving it were American, Buffalo, Robinson, who we've already talked about in Ithaca, and Colonial Airlines. And Colonial later merged with some other airlines and became American Airlines. But by 1957, there were 50 weekday departures between American, Eastern, and Mohawk, but nonstops out of Syracuse didn't go past Buffalo or New York City, which is not really all that far. But by the mid '70s, when I started using Hancock International, Mohawk's successor, Allegheny, had the most flights, and they're the guys that I used to fly. And for a long time, they had two separate wings, so you had separate security to go through for each one. And if you were trying to go from one to the other, you picked the wrong wing, you had to go all the way back out through security. But the post 9/11 renovation that they did at Hancock has got just one security entranceway now, and it's all revised and modernized. Despite the international part of the name, the last time I checked, Syracuse has no international flights, although they could claim that from time to time, Air Canada has provided service across the lake to Toronto. A very little known fact, at least was not known to me, there's the Aurora Airport. Actually, it's called Matchmade Airport, and it's just east of the Wells campus on Dog Corners Road, just off Dublin Hill Road. And I've never flown into it, and I've never met anybody who even talked about flying into it, but it looks very convenient to campus if you don't mind landing on grass. But even more convenient than that to campus is the lake. And a few flyers have taken advantage of that. And in fact, when I was at Reunion, Fran and I were there sometime in the early 2000s. I don't remember exactly when, but there was a couple, and she was from the class of '48. And they flew a seaplane from New Hampshire to Reunion and landed and tied it up at the Wells dock. And of all the ways that I've ever seen to get to Wells, that was the most novel that I can imagine. Now, the next time I saw them, that couple at Reunion,
5 years later.
5 years later, right? They didn't fly their seaplane. And I said, hey, what's up with that? And they explained to me that on a recent trip, they had landed on the wrong lake somewhere in New England. And they took that as a sign that it was time to quit while they were still ahead. Well, so on that note, I'd like to conclude, but thank you so much for attending this Learning by the Lake. And thanks to Jane Marsh for her assistance and for the book on the history of Wells College. That was indispensable in preparing this session. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you'll join me in making a gift to the college. And I feel sure that Henry Wells would appreciate your support. And as Una said at the beginning here, I also hope you'll mark your calendars for the next Learning by the Lake session, April 13th. It'll be presented by a Wells alum, Alex Riyad, who's a playwright. He's going to talk about that. And I hope you'll check out the Wells website for the first in-person Learning by the Lake sessions. One is going to be given by Marty Severins and friends. It's Wells and the Women's Movement, and it'll be held consecutively right after reunion in June. And the Book Art Summer Institute, which has got 8 classes that are being held this July. So I urge you to go to the Wells website and look at registration for those. And I want to leave you with one last thought, and that is Even's rule.
Oh, stop. We want to check this. The chat room's been kind of busy. We want to go back and see who's been.
Oh, yeah,
who's been
yeah.
talking to us.
Yeah, well, anyone who wants to unmute and ask questions, feel free. And I will try to answer questions that I see in the chat here. Betsy Kimball Rogers
I think
mentions,
Stephen earlier.
Cornell crew races from Bleachers on Flat Cars. Wow, yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, and Jane Marsh told me that she took the train from Philadelphia up to Wells in the first half of the 1950s, and typically would take the overnight train. So you'd be sitting in your seat, I imagine, trying to fall asleep, and the train would be stopping in every little town between Philadelphia and Ithaca, and getting into Ithaca at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's probably worse than flying the red eye.
Wait a second. Go scroll back a second to Mary. There you go. Mary Feeney. Hi. I'm trying to do some research on Brenda Euland and her mother, who was a very good friend of Florence Wells Carpenter, but a political opponent when it came to the suffrage movement. Interestingly, it didn't stop her from talking her friend into sending both of her daughters to Wells. So you and I need to catch up some about that book, since I've not seen anything about that before.
Yeah, Lisa, we can't sell the Wells Fargo coach, though. The alums would rise up in arms. So maybe we can take a loan out on it, though.
Randy, I really wasn't suggesting that. But, one can't help but wonder, like that lone baseball card you find in your grandfather's attic or something,
Right. No, I get it. Yeah.
I realize it's heresy to even suggest such a thing.
Yes. Well, it's just an interesting thought.
I wonder, there will probably come a time when it's going to be too fragile for, drunk students to ride to commencement. So I don't know if we need to talk to the
Drunk
to the
students?
folks at-
Fran, what is this of which you speak?
Oh, you have no idea, right?
No idea. Never heard of it.
I'm wondering if maybe there'll come a day when we have to talk the Hanson brothers into building us a replica.
Oh, Dottie, I think here asked the question, how many stagecoaches does Wells own? And really, there's just the 2 coaches. There's the Omnibus and then the Wells Fargo or the Concord coach.
Randy, the picture you had of the omnibus shows the back of a woman in a lovely blue jacket, and I swear that's Gail Fletcher Edwards.
It could be.
Couldn't be, because when was that picture from?
Let's see here. Getting close.
I'm getting there. Getting there.
That's the.
There
that
you go.
was
When was that picture taken? If that isn't, well, it might be too tall to be Gail. I love you, Gail, but that might be too tall to be Gail.
I don't see a person.
Yeah, I don't remember. It's a stock photo that I've pulled out of the,
Okay.
the archives or.
I don't know the date of that picture. The coach is in great shape though. The paint job and everything. So it
Right.
looks pretty much like that now, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, that's,
The omnibus still has the original wallpapering on the inside, which is all very elaborate. And I wonder, oh my God, how are we going to be able to save that?
Randy,
So there's a question by Cindy asking what class Jane Marsh was, and I hope I'm not getting this wrong.
1955.
55, right?
Randy, I made a
Cindy.
comment earlier. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I made a comment earlier, now that this picture is back up. My father always referred to this as the Fifth Avenue coach or the Fifth Avenue bus.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Um,
Yes, and
then
that's accurate.
One other thing I wanted to share was after the passenger trains stopped running, the college still counted on the railroad for coal to the power plant that's on the lake side of the road across from Cleveland. It used to be run by
Mhm.
steam and they needed coal to make the steam. And I remember, I think it was the late 60s, possibly early 70s, when the last coal train came through, because my parents had a house on the lake, and we every time the train would go by, the driver would blast the horn and wave to us. We were kids, we were waving, but I remember it was the late 70s or late 60s or early 70s when that last train with the load of coal came through.
Linda Schwab, are you still on the line?
Yep, I'm here, and I think Mary Hotchkiss was here.
Okay, tell us
pray for her.
about Oliver Weber, because I've heard about him in the taxi service, but I don't know the details.
I can't tell you too much more than that. I'm trying to think what department his father taught in. I think it might have been psychology. Someone asked about that, but I wanted to give space to my friend Mary Hotchkiss, who was the one who rode that last train. I think it was spring of 70. Is that right, Hotchkiss?
Can you hear me? Because I'm having trouble with figuring this out.
I hear you.
We hear you.
Okay, yeah,
you.
well, I graduated in 72, so it could have been the spring of 70. And what actually happened was Connie Root and I, it was a weekend and we were bored. So we hitched to Union Springs, except we weren't very brave about hitching. So we'd stand in the road with our thumbs out and then we'd pull them in. And finally a student went by. So we hitched a ride to Union Springs and didn't really know what to do. So we went to the liquor store and got some cheap wine. And then realized, oh, the railroad tracks are right here, and let's go. And there was kind of a marina boat storage place or something. So we'll look at the lake, and we walked down, and the train came in, and it stopped, and it was engine with I think one coal car. Maybe they had another one they left there. I don't know, but so we stuck our thumbs out, and the engineer said, hop up in the engine, and so we rode in the engine back, and we passed the station in Aurora, and went up, and they delivered the coal car to the steam to the powerhouse, and then took us and dropped us off at the station. And it was a wonderful experience, a lot of fun.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, you were the last people to ride that, as far as we know.
Yeah, we probably were. I don't think it was literally the last train, but we were probably the last students to ride it.
Yeah.
What
I'm
fun.
struck by that phrase, Mary. It was a weekend and we were bored. Oh, wait, sorry.
This is Roberta Houston Young in Los Angeles. I started in the fall of 1970. I remember no trains. My
Really?
grandfather ran a railroad and I would have remembered.
Yeah.
Well, then maybe it was 70 that we was our last ride.
Yeah,
Yeah,
spring
I
of
would've been-
70, yeah.
I would have
Yeah.
been besotted if I'd seen a train.
I'll bet.
Someone asked if Wells now borrows horses to pull the stagecoach, and yes, we do. I don't remember the name of the gentleman, but he has a company where he does rent out his horses. And right now he's got 4 beautiful, they're called Percherons, which is a particular breed of horse. They're massive and they're dark black, and he braids their manes and he really makes them
The
shine. And
Hitchcocks.
those horses, is it Hitchcock's?
No, Cindy, it used to be, but it isn't anymore.
Not anymore?
No,
Oh.
There they are. There they are. But
They're
those
out-
horses,
The wagons
they
are housed at
know
Ledyard
when they're
Farm.
pulling this
Look at
coach,
those. Look at
they
those.
love it. And they just kind of, strut and shake their heads and are so pleased with themselves when they're pulling on that coach. It's a great thing to see.
A little bit about where the coach is now. It's at Ledyard Farms, as I understand it,
Mhm.
and the omnibus as well. But Ledyard Farms raises Morgans, excellent racehorses, but not
Oh.
for this type of work. So I think the gentleman now, I know there's a guy in King Ferry, and I can't think of his name, but it's been a long time since there were any Hitchcock horses to draw the coach.
Mm.
Yeah. I remember the coaches being stored in a barn or garage that was next to the then French house.
Mhm.
And you could just
Oh, yeah.
walk in there and sit in them. It wasn't
Yep.
even locked up. So, so I was a French major and visited the French house, and sometimes we'd go over in the barn and sit in the coaches. I'm sure they're better guarded now.
Given what they're worth, I hope so.
Yeah.
If
Well,
one is an aficionado of coaches, stage coaches, and their history in the state of New York, Mohawk Mountain House, give or take in New Paltz, but also, with a certain access to the Erie Canal, et cetera, has an incredible museum, unbelievable museum. History and development of these various coaches and how they came to serve various parts of New York State. I recommend that to anybody. Not that you can afford to stay there, but that's another discussion.
But they still have the museum?
Yes, Mohawk has an incredible museum of coaches.
Oh.
I mean, it literally with the the passementry that's coming down, the isinglass windows, as they said in Oklahoma, just remarkable, the preservation they put into that. And just as an aside, Mohawk Mountain House is also literally the home of the founding of the United Nations.
Well, thank you all very much. I really
That's
appreciate
awesome.
your coming out and listening. We're gonna wrap it up, I guess, but if anybody has any questions or comments, you want to send them to Una, or if you want to email either, but she'll make sure that they get to us, and we'll try to answer anything we can. But thanks again for coming out.
Thank you, Randy and Fran. This is great.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.
It was
All
fun.
right,
Randy, Fran.
everybody's gonna make the trip in a
Thanks,
couple
guys.
of weeks up to the reunion.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
I can't. I've got a long-standing wedding commitment that weekend. It's killing me that I can't go. 'Cause
Oh, bummer.
it's 77, Fran. I mean, our the women who are just above us.
Mhm.
Is it safe to say that 78 was most represented tonight?
Maybe so.
No evens. I'm just saying. Stelly, Lemishaw. Just maybe.
Yeah.
I'd like to say,
All
I
right,
think
guys.
67 did pretty well too.
Okay.
And yes, I'd like to put a pitch in for the Learning by the Lake program that will take place after reunion. It will take place beginning on Sunday of reunion and last for 2 days. We're going to explore Wells and the women's movement, and it will showcase not only the facilities in Auburn and Seneca Falls Fran is going to give us some of her insights from her research about Wells women. We're going to be visiting the archives with Tiffany Raymond, and we're also going to go to the Howland store in Sherwood Forest, Sherwood. And I think it's going to be a great program. This was something, actually, Randy, you'll agree that we inaugurated the Learning by the Lake program back in 2020. We wanted to do a 5-day, full out program, but thanks to COVID, it didn't happen. So this is a little bit of a truncated, more focused post-reunion program. I managed to register today. It's there on the website. If you register for reunion, it's if you follow all of the tabs, it's there. It's a little hidden, but I recommend that you pursue, and it's going to be a great opportunity for all to really focus on Wells and the women's suffrage movement. So
Forgive me, who's speaking right now?
That's Marty Severance.
Thank you. Sorry, Marty.
Marty,
Sorry,
1967.
Yeah, sorry, it just didn't show up. I can't be there on the 4th, but is this a 2-day thing that you could register for just for the 5th and 6th?
Yeah,
Yes.
it would
As far as
begin
I'm
Sunday
concerned.
afternoon. And then be there
Yes,
for
why
Monday,
not?
Tuesday.
It's
Ooh.
a $200 package beginning on Sunday. We're going to convene at 11 o'clock and go through until Tuesday, 48 hours later.
Gee, here to Aurora by 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, the morning after a wedding. I'll work on this, girls.
Great.
If
That'll
anyone
be
could
fun.
pull it off, Lisa, it's you.
Thanks for
And one last commercial. We're always looking for people who are interested in presenting a topic. It doesn't necessarily have to be about Wells. It just needs to be about something near and dear to your heart. And we'll be looking for people for subsequent live learning by the lakes, because this event that Marty's talking about is going to be the inaugural of what we hope are many. And we'll also be looking to set up the virtual Learning by the Lake schedule for the 22-23 years. So contact the alumni office if you have some interest in a particular topic and want to get on our schedule.
And I'll put a plug in for the Wells Book Arts summer programs. It must have been, well, actually, no, it was summer of 2007 that I spent a week in the book arts program, brought a friend from home and said, Kathy, you're a designer, you're into all of the fibers and fonts. And it was like summer camp for adults. I felt like I was 15 and, but trust me, learning to bind books and write with calligraphy beats all those lanyard keychains. Trust me, it was phenomenal. Couldn't have enjoyed
Bob
it.
Lamascola will appreciate the plug. Yeah, he's worked real hard to get it set up, so I hope people take
Well, and Gail and George were there that week. I mean, we had a really cool group, but it was, I can't recommend it more.
All right, all.
Okay, everyone have a good night.
Take
Thanks,
care.
guys.
Thank
See
you.
y'all soon.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Fran and Randy.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks, Fran and Randy. Bye-bye.